Episode 47, the publisher of Forbes magazine, Rich Karlgaard. Welcome to The Art of Excellence, a show about people doing extraordinary things in their lives. I'm your host, Glenn Zweig. Thanks for joining me. My guest today is Rich Karlgaard. Rich is a best-selling author, award-winning entrepreneur, and speaker. He is the publisher of Forbes magazine and is based in Silicon Valley. He is a renowned lecturer on technology, innovation, corporate culture, and a number of other important business issues, and the author of 3 books. His latest one titled Late Bloomers: The Power of Patience in a World Obsessed with Early Achievement. Rich, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Glenn.
My pleasure. So before we dig into the book, I want to know a little bit more about you. I want to hear the story. You grew up in North Dakota, which I know next to nothing about, so I thought you could just tell me, what is it like growing up in North Dakota? What was the family like? What was the community like? Give me a snapshot.
Sure. I grew up in the capital city of Bismarck, which is about triple the population now because of the oil boom that it was when I grew up, at a town of about 30,000. My dad was a high school athletic director, and because Bismarck was the capital city and they had a really great indoor arena, he also ran the state basketball and wrestling tournament. So very athletic family. In fact, I have a younger brother, Joe Karlgaard, who's the athletic director at Rice today. It was a time when you could really live a pretty pleasant life on a middle-class income. And I don't mean, a lot of people talk about middle-class incomes, but they're really upper middle class. They just don't want to say that. But hearing about the salary of a high school principal, and my mom was a stay-at-home mom, and we had 4 kids, and I never felt lacking anything. It was a great town to grow up in, but also a great town, I must say, that I left too.
But how about you in terms of, were you a driven kid? Were you sort of aimless? Were your parents pushing you a lot? Like, how were you wired, I guess?
Well, I desperately wanted to be a great athlete. My dad was a great high school athlete, and he was, after all, this well-known athletic director. And I just wasn't very good at traditional sports like football, basketball, and baseball. I was small and slow, which is not a good combination. But I fell in love with distance running. And distance runners are kind of the hippies of athletes back in the 1970s. We had heroes like Steve Prefontaine and Frank Shorter, and I poured my heart and soul into running, and so much that I probably stole from my motivation to do well in schools, because I was a B student, barely made the high school honor roll, which is the top 20%. I was a good enough runner. We were a state champion team. I ran in the fast heat of the state mile, and I finished second to last. So I was high mediocre, but I really did love it.
So you were clearly competitive. You're on this track team, and you cared about running. You said you're a B student, which isn't bad. It's not going to be a highlight reel per se. But did you just not care about the academic part of your life, or was it a struggle for you? It sounds like in certain areas you could sort of get yourself together and really drive to achieve something.
Well, now and then there would be flashes that I had more potential academically. On one day, there was a state math test. The whole state, all high schoolers in the state of North Dakota were given the test, and I scored the highest in my city of Bismarck. And people were kind of surprised. I was in calculus, where I finished in the state mile. I was about the worst student in the calculus class. And I later tried to think about why I was unmotivated as a student, and I have a couple of theories. One is I was exhausted from track and field practice all the time. It was almost hard to eat dinner when I came home. I would make myself a chocolate milkshake and go to bed. I had no energy to study. And the other was that I wore thick glasses, and this is before I had contact lenses, and I was embarrassed by those thick glasses, so I'd walk walk around high school without glasses, and I couldn't see what was going on. This is my theory now. I wasn't really cognizant of that, but I was often mystified by what was going on, even though I had some native gifts, as the state math test foretold.
Well, you went on to Stanford, which is one of the best schools in the country. And even back then, on a relative basis, was really hard to get into. So how were you able to get there?
Well, I transferred out of junior college. I got my grades up to about a 3.5, and I was captain of the track and cross country team. So I had the combination of extracurriculars, being from an obscure state. Funny enough, since we're doing this interview in Palo Alto and Stanford is right across the road, Stanford was an easier institution to get into when I got into it. Today, it's a 3% admissions rate. It was 25% admissions rate back then. It was a regionally excellent university on its way up. But the whole Silicon Valley boom was mostly in front of it, and the gigantic source of donations that really helped propel Stanford to, the top of the charts was yet to come.
And so how was it for you going to Stanford and being amongst all of that talent there, academic talent?
Oh, I was blown out of the water, Glenn. I wasn't prepared for it all. I was going from junior college, my local junior college, to Stanford, and I would take classes like Japanese politics and U.S. constitutional law and do very poorly at them. And I was discouraged, and I found solace going to the library and reading back issues of Sports Illustrated. I like to say that even though my official major was political science, my real major was Sports Illustrated. And it was a bit of embarrassment, and because I had roommates, one of my good friends was Phi Beta Kappa in his junior year. He was a varsity volleyball player. He would go on to Stanford Law School, join what became the dominant law firm in Silicon Valley. Another roommate went off to University of Pennsylvania, get a master's in chemical engineering, went to work on the space shuttle program. So I was surrounded by some high achievers, and I wasn't one of them.
Well, you're reading all of Sports Illustrated.
Well, I was reading Sports Illustrated, and I got to tell you, Glenn, when a dozen years after that, I was beginning to make traction, and I became friends with a guy who was a loan officer at Silicon Valley Bank. My wife was working at Silicon Valley Bank, a new bank back then. And we had an idea to start a club in Silicon Valley because we wanted to be on the inside. We were obscure outsiders. And so we started a club called the Churchill Club, which exists today, 35 years later. And we asked Bob Noyce of Intel fame to be the first speaker. And we had an oversold audience of 300 people, and we were on our way. A couple years after that, we decided, wow, there's really a community here in Silicon Valley. You've got Stanford community, the business community, and they're really coming together. We're just like living in Florence, Italy in the 1500s. And what should we do about this? Because the club was a nonprofit, so we decided to start a magazine. This is when the disruptive technology was a Macintosh and laser printer. And my friend Tony Perkins was the fundraiser and the business person, and I was in charge of coming up with the look and feel and attitude of the magazine. And I thought to myself, this is one of the best ideas I've ever had, and it really propelled my career. I decided that most business magazines were boring, and if they had the zip and the pop of Sports Illustrated, because after all, business is a competitive environment. People play to win. Why shouldn't a sports magazine be a model for a business magazine? And so we created Silicon Valley's first business magazine called Upside. There were plenty of trade magazines around, but there hadn't been a really good business magazine on Silicon Valley, the business of getting a company started, seeking venture capital funding, taking a company public, growing it like grease lightning. And, and these people around us like Larry Ellison, Bill Gates, and Scott McNealy of Sun Microsystems were doing just that. And we wanted to be on the inside, but cover it in the way that Sports Illustrated would cover the National Football League. And so that's what we did. It got everybody's attention, and it was the defining event in my career, was taking a chance doing a startup business magazine and doing it unconventionally.
Now, just to take a step back, and by the way, I used to read it religiously. It was a fantastic magazine. If you're in the Valley or if you cared about what was happening in the Valley or even tech at large, and this was the go-to magazine. But I want to point out, because it's important as we dig into the book in a little bit, which is that you didn't do this like fresh out of college, right? You had a few year gap between when you graduated and when this sort of lightning bolt hit you. So what were those few years like? It wasn't so easy for you in terms of, career and getting into some sort of settled profession. Is that right?
To be really honest, Glenn, I had kind of an arrogance that I had a Stanford diploma, even though I barely got through with the minimum number of credits. And really, a gentleman's C at Stanford was a B, because you could drop a class 6 weeks before the final. So if you're on your way to a C, you would drop the class. Who would want a C when you could easily avoid it? So I graduated with a 3.1 average, which is the equivalent of a C. Well, nobody wanted a political science major with a 3.1 average, despite whatever college degree they had. And I was confused about that. I thought that I would do better. But in fact, I struggled. I had a 7-month career at Runner's World magazine, and I was sloppy about it. I made errors in the racing results. I mean, I had minimal responsibilities, and I still managed to screw it up. I got into a fight with the owner's wife. I mean, all the things that you're not supposed to do in your first job. And but I needed to support myself. I needed to eat. And so I became a security guard, a temporary typist, and a dishwasher. It was embarrassing. At age 25, I was still the security guard.
And you got fired from one of those early jobs, is that right?
I left Runner's World before I was going to get fired. My attitude was bad. I was sloppy. I'm just thoroughly embarrassed thinking about it today. When I think about all the entrepreneur went through to launch Runner's World, and I was treating his pride and his joy and his baby like some throwaway job. It embarrasses me to say that that's the way I acted in my early and middle 20s, but indeed that's the way I acted.
So let's go back to the magazine. And it's not just about starting a magazine, really, at least from my vantage point. It's starting your life, from a career perspective. So here you are, you're 26, and you sort of put it in the book. Your brain finally woke up, and you suddenly started to have this success. And so I'm just curious, was it starting the magazine that woke you up? Was there some other job, or was it just that you gotten older, more mature, and realized you can't pay the rent, and put aside for the future being a dishwasher? Like, what was it that was the spark for you?
The spark was that through a temp typing job, I got an assignment at a research institute, the Electric Power Research Institute in Palo Alto, and they had a locker room, and a lot of the program managers and engineers and scientists would go out and run at noon. And I soon began to run with them. And one of them said, "Why are you a temp typist? You sound like a pretty bright guy. You certainly know a lot about running." And I said, I just fessed up. I said, "I really don't know. It embarrasses me. I'd like to do better." "How would you like to be a technical writer?" he said. And I just jumped at the opportunity. And by now I knew that I was running out of runway on my adult life, and I couldn't screw this up. But quite to my surprise, I really enjoyed it, because it was the first time I'd worked with scientists and engineers. And so this liberal arts, this political science major, whose father was a high school athletic director, I'd never had any exposure to kind of the scientific method, the engineer's way of thinking about the universe. And that really began to open up a whole new side of my brain. And to my surprise, I liked it. I also met the woman who would become my wife, and that had a really healthy, maturing result to it.
Wait, by the way, was that your politically correct way of saying your wife was like, get a job? Or
it was more, no, I had the job by then at the Electric Power Research Institute when I met her, but it was more reason not to screw it up, to take it seriously. But then another really important event was seeing the 1984 Super Bowl on television, because in that Super Bowl was an ad for something called the Apple Macintosh. And I had an insight that turned out to be pretty accurate, and that is this Macintosh is going to be a publisher's dream. I mean, with fonts and font sizes and all of this, just seeing that before knowing that there would be page layout programs like Quark Express and PageMaker, or not even hearing of a company called Adobe, I knew something revolutionary was happening here. And I bought one of the early models, and I taught myself desktop publishing. And so I was able to expand my technical writing into a business where I would create newsletters for companies. And therefore, now working up to the point where my friend Tony and I started the Churchill Club, we had a way to promote the Churchill Club through newsletters. This is pre-web, you understand. And then doing that, we realized we had the mechanism to start a magazine. And little did I realize that doing a 4-color magazine was a lot more complex than doing a 2-color newsletter, but you learned. We plunged in. We raised money from one of Tim's boyhood friends, a venture capitalist of note today, Tim Draper, who gave Tony enough money to quit his job at Silicon Valley Bank. And we were off and running. And because we took that Sports Illustrated attitude that though we were two obscure people, we were going to act like we were not obscure. When we wrote about companies or when we interviewed people, we were going to write about them and interview them as peers. And that was just a quantum leap in my confidence, to take that attitude. And Tony was so encouraging of that. So when I sat down and had 4 hours of interviews with Bill Gates a couple years after starting Upside, and the Wall Street Journal and Forbes and Fortune were not getting that kind of time, I did it with this sense of confidence that I could ask them anything and not be embarrassed about anything, that I wasn't going to go in there shuffling and bowing my head. And I think people caught that attitude about Upside.
So what was the end result of Upside? Did you sell it? Was it a financial success?
It was not a financial success in our first 3 years. It became a financial success. But what happened at the end of year 3, just after I'd gotten this monster interview with Bill Gates, is that we were struggling to meet payroll. Some new investors came in, and I learned the meaning of what is called a cram down round. That at that point, my partner and I each had 30% of the magazine, 30% ownership. And after the cram down financial round, we each had 3%. And I was still making very little money because it was a startup. Steve Forbes had caught wind of Upside by then. In fact, months before, he came out to visit us at Upside with the idea that he might buy us. But then his chief financial officer said, this thing is a financial wreck. We probably should stay away from it. And so I let it be known to Steve Forbes through an intermediary that I was available and I would love to work for him. And he called me up at home and he offered me a salary that, based on the salary that I was making at Upside, was a jaw dropper for me. I mean, it was like 4x what I was making. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that this man had that kind of faith in me to do that. But he did, and I became the startup editor of something called Forbes ASAP, which is a futurist magazine. The investment for me of doing a startup magazine and doing it with an attitude that got people's attention, I say was either the biggest lucky break I've ever had or the wisest thing I've ever done in my career.
So you went into Forbes on the editorial side, and at some point, I assume, sort of pivoted or expanded to get onto the business side of things to then eventually become publisher.
Well, I always liked speaking in public, and I always liked going on sales calls with the sales force to position Forbes ASAP. And the Forbes brothers saw that. I cleaned up well on those kind of calls. And in 1998, the current publisher of Forbes, the then publisher of Forbes, took a job with the World Economic Forum, and the brothers named me publisher. But with the different kind of role, most publishers are in charge of revenue. When you hear publisher, it's like the producer in a movie. The director is the editor, and the producer is the publisher. And so the publisher is usually in charge of ad revenue, circulation revenue, other forms of revenue. And I knew that I wouldn't have credibility with the sales force that I'd never been a salesperson. And I said, you can't do it. I turned them down. And Steve said, no, we have a different model in mind. We want you to be a columnist in the front of the magazine to write about the intersection of technology and business and how the web and all this new stuff is going to reshape business. We'd like you to go on sales calls. You won't be responsible. You won't have a quota, and do TV and do speeches and the other things that that you appear to be pretty good at. And so I became publisher in 1998, and so 21 years later, I still am in that odd role because I've spent my entire 27 years, including the 21 years I've been publisher, living here in Silicon Valley, not in the New York area where Forbes is based.
So I wanted to capture one story going back to Stanford, and I'm curious how much this created some kind of psyche for you, later in life as you became successful in the publishing industry. And I think if I recall the way you told it was, I think it was one of the breaks. A lot of your classmates were going off wherever they were going to all parts of the world on their fancy vacations, and you, I think you weren't in a position to go. You decided to go on a run, and you sort of kept running and running and running, and a short run turned into a mild run to a long run, and eventually a very character-defining moment for you. Can you retell that story?
Sure. I was in the shape of my life. I was only 2 years at Stanford after transferring from a junior college, but I was running 70 or 80 miles a week. But it was spring break of my junior year. I didn't go on a ski vacation or Mexico or any place else because I couldn't afford it. And I decided on a Saturday morning that I would take my usual weekend long run, which was on the order of 15 miles. And I got to an intersection where normally I would have gone ahead, and I decided on a whim to take a right turn and go up the coastal mountain range. And I thought, well, this is kind of insane, but why not give it a try? And the climb ended up being 1,300 or 1,400 feet on twisty roads, and I got all the way to the top. And then an even crazier idea occurred, and I thought, why not go down again, but on the coastal side, and see how far you might want to go. And so I did, and I ended up running all the way to the Pacific Ocean, which coincidentally was the length of a marathon. It was 26 miles. Then I thought, well, I have to get back. How am I going to get back, number one? And number two, I'm just absolutely bonked, sugar bonked, thirsty as heck. I hadn't brought along any provisions at all. Luckily for me, it was not a hot day. But I ended up doing something out of desperation. I begged for money on the beach, and I got about $5 total. And I went into the general store at San Gregorio Beach, and I bought Gatorade and candy bars. They didn't have these fancy nutrition bars you have today, but they had Gatorade. And I quaffed it down, and then I started a slow jog back to the base of the hills. Pretty soon, I was at the base of the mountains again, and I thought, well, give it a go, see if you can make it back up to the top, and then declare victory and hitchhike home. And I got there, and then I thought, well, God, how hard can it be to run down the mountain to the base? And I did, and it was hard. I mean, my legs felt like cement. And then finally, when I got to the bottom, I thought, oh, for crying out loud, you're so close, just slog your way back.
So how far are we talking about?
We're talking about 26 miles out and 26 miles back.
So you ran an ultra marathon,
yeah,
without even planning,
yeah,
off of a Gatorade and a couple Snicker bars or something.
Yeah.
I guess I'm trying to understand beyond just for the fun and sake of pushing yourself. What was behind it? Like, you're at the campus, no one's there, everyone's off. Were you angry or bitter, or were you depressed? Was there any sort of underlying emotion that sort of drove you to do something like that?
No, nothing like that. I would say that the thing that drove me was curiosity. If I had tried to plan to do that, I'm sure I could not have completed that run. I would have gone out too fast. I would have failed. I'm absolutely convinced of that. But the fact that I just took off and became an explorer and took that first right turn and went up that first curve of a hill, and then the kind of, oh, hell, why not aspect to it, is I discovered something really important about myself that I realized years later. I wish I would have absorbed the full lesson at the time, because it would have been a real confidence builder. You asked me earlier on that, am I a competitive person? Or you assumed that I was because I ran track and cross country. And the answer is, I'm not. I hate competitive pressures. There are runners, who are really competitive, who love beating the other runners. And I was never one of those runners. I was the kind of runner that, how far and how fast can I go? What would happen if I added 20 miles a week to my training, just out of curiosity? More of the explorer type. I've developed this idea that successful people, and here in Silicon Valley, you could throw a dart, at anybody walking down University or Lytton Street, and the probability is you'd hit someone more successful than I am. Many people are successful. The majority of people are successful are competitive people. They set goals for themselves, and they relentlessly pursue those goals, and they succeed. I think there's a subset of us who achieve some success because we're explorers. We don't really know what we're setting out to achieve, but something really arouses our curiosity and we decide to follow it. And we enjoy a little bit of success, and then we go, well, what if I followed it a little more, and a little more, and a little more? Oftentimes, Glenn, when you see a pairing of company founders, the thing that makes the great pairing is one of them is the real goal-driven person. They like to close the sale. They like to meet the numbers. They like to vanquish the competition. And the other one, in the words of Gordon Moore describes himself as an accidental entrepreneur. He was just really motivated by seeing if this integrated circuit could work. And then if they could bring the yields up enough to the point where the Apollo space program decided to make a major bet on an integrated circuit-based computer rather than a transistor-based computer from IBM or others. It was this one step at a time. I wonder how far I could get if. And I discovered that that's the kind of person that I am. And the more I put a specific goal on my shoulders, the more I tense up. I don't respond in a really great way to competitive pressure. I respond to the wonder of exploration.
Well, this is a perfect segue to talk about the book. I guess let's start with some definition here. You define late bloomer as a person who fulfills their potential later than expected. So I guess the starting point is expected by whom? By society? By your parents? Friends?
All of those. And the expected is contextual. For example, if you're going to be a software programmer, it's expected that you're really going to you're going to demonstrate your capabilities pretty darn early. I mean, the great software programmers show up often in their teens and 20s. And if you're not a great software programmer by your 30s, if you break through in your 30s, you're a late bloomer in your field. If you're a great historian who can write great popular history books like David McCulloch, if you broke through in your 30s, you'd be an early bloomer, unlike the software programmer who broke through in their 30s would be a late bloomer. So it's contextual. But yes, I was noticing that we particularly in high achievement cities and the suburbs around them, places like Palo Alto, California, we put an awful lot of pressure on kids to demonstrate their academic excellence early, whether they're natively gifted on that track or not. And is that doing all the good that we think it is? And some kids are breaking through and really responding to that kind of pressure, and other kids are demoralized and are not. And so we've wound up in a situation in the United States today where the rates of anxiety, depression, and even suicide among teens and young adults is rising very dangerously.
It's an important point. And I guess what I'm trying to understand, and maybe you can help clarify, is the depression rates, anxiety, all of these things, absolutely all-time highs, suicide rates, et cetera. Just for the moment to play devil's advocate, I mean, haven't we always been obsessed with early achievement? Haven't parents always put the pressure on? Like, what is it is it social media? Like, what is it that's happening today that's so different from years past that's driving, all of these social issues?
I think America has always seen itself as a youthful nation in love with people who go out and do something big early. They seem almost like the gods among us when they do that. And, it's more glamorous to have been F. Scott Fitzgerald breaking through with major novels in his early and middle 20s than it is the plotter who, Frank McCourt, who breaks through in his 60s. And that's true across the arts. It's true. Sports, of course, skews young. And particularly in the modern economy today, that high finance, shorthanded by saying Wall Street hedge funds and high-powered venture capital, and high technology as we think of it today, which is mainly web software, are places where really young, precocious, talented, driven people can make their mark very early and very big. And so they become the template. I further think, you ask why now, I think people are nervous about where their kids are going to fit in the economy going forward. An economy that is more and more driven by artificial intelligence and all of that. And the two most lucrative fields in the U.S. economy over the last 20 years have been high finance and software-based technology. Now, what do you have to do to get to play in the big leagues in those fields? Well, it sure as heck helps if you have gone to about one of maybe 10 universities, the Ivies, MIT, Stanford, Caltech. If you really look around Silicon Valley, where we're doing this podcast today, here in Palo Alto, it's kind of a semi-closed club. Semi-closed, not entirely closed.
It's a bubble.
It's a bubble.
Sure.
Closed really to people who've gone to those kind of schools and who've got the secret handshake that they scored 800 on their math SAT. And so I think that this trickles down into society, trickles down into schools, trickles down into parenting, and that if you've got this window of opportunity that starts when you start taking standardized tests, that the Super Bowl is when you sit down for the SAT test at age 16 or 17, and then where you got into school, and that backs up. You see the most extreme manifestation of that in the college bribery scandal. But even that's just rich people who could afford to do what many others would want to do if they could afford to do it. And what you see among kind of your aspirational middle and upper middle class families is that they're expending extraordinary amounts on private schools and tutors and SAT prep classes and things like that, all to get that edge based on this belief that if you don't shine during that early window of opportunity, you may not get another chance to shine again. And I wanted to see if that was true.
Not to defend it, but I think a lot of these self-induced pressures is what led to some of the recent scandals, which, by the way, is ironic because the very people that are paying all this outrageous money are the very people that have the relationships, if you will, the social capital that can get their kids into whatever kind of company and job afterwards. But certainly that's maybe some of the backdrop as to what drove some of that.
A really important interview that I did doing the research for Late Bloomers is to talk to Carol Dweck. Carol Dweck's the hero of mine. Her book Mindset has sold a couple of million copies. If you ask Satya Nadella at Microsoft, the most influential book that he's read of the last 10 years would be Mindset. Well, getting people to read Mindset was one of the tools that he used. And the book Mindset is about a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset. And oftentimes early success can lead to a fixed mindset. You become kind of a know-it-all and you think that you know everything you need to know in your field. And in her book Mindset, Carol Dweck writes about John McEnroe, who was an early prodigy in tennis. He won the NCAA tennis tournament as a freshman at Stanford, dropped out, became a pro. And then what happened is that some of the people who were lesser talents in McEnroe's mind, or probably more accurately, later blooming talents, began to rise to his level and in some cases surpassing him. And rather than doubling down on his training, or things like that, he just grew resentful and angry. And so we remember McEnroe not as this youthful prodigy. We remember as the guy who threw clubs and argued with officials. And even McEnroe has expressed regret that he allowed himself to do that. He was asked, do you consider yourself among the top 10 of male tennis players of all time? And he said, I could have been. But Carol Dweck, I went to see Carol Dweck on the Stanford campus, and I congratulated her on Mindset. And I said, has anything changed? Have you changed any opinions since 10 years ago when you came out with Mindset? She leaned forward. She said, it's gotten a lot worse. Well, what do you mean by that? And she said, the kids I see at Stanford today are exhausted and brittle, and they don't want to mar their perfect records. So as a result of all that hard work and all of that private schooling and tutoring and prep work that many of them went through, as a result of that, they win the prize. They get into Stanford, and it's like they're done.
When you mentioned that, and then going back to McEnroe and just thinking of the age he was when he came onto the scene, it's sort of this late teen, early 20s. And I thought it was really interesting in the book, you say that there's a neuroscience explanation that between the ages of 18 and 25, the brain, or more specifically the prefrontal cortex, it's not fully formed. So our executive function skills are still being developed. And so here we are, the very period in our lives when we're supposed to be so hyper-focused on picking our life's work, but actually it may be the worst time for us.
Yeah, there's a psychologist named Jeffrey Arnott who was a psychologist, but looking at the neuroscience, came up with this idea that the ages 18 to 25 or so forms a period that is neither truly adult nor adolescent. It's the emerging adult. And he wrote a book about it, and it's changed a lot of people's thinking about this. Now, 25 is the onset of prefrontal cortex maturity, is the midpoint in a bell curve. So some achieve it earlier and some achieve it later. And there's even more recent thinking that says with these subsequent generation of people in the affluent world, it's happening later. We look back at World War II, and it's some of those 18 and 19 and 20-year-old young men really seemed like men, or World War II turned them into young men, and you don't see that as much today. But anyway, what we do when we ask kids and adolescents and emerging adults to focus so hard on what we think they should be, they are essentially trading their youthful curiosity for a determined focus. And that is a trade. And if you ask CEOs, what do you value most in your employees, as Fortune magazine did in their cover story in 2017, the CEOs of some pretty high-performing companies like Genentech and Intuit said the number one quality is curiosity, because without curiosity, there's no growth. Curiosity is the lodestone of growth. Well, we're not teaching curiosity. We're teaching the opposite. We're telling kids, if you can't be the best in something, don't even try it. Go out for some obscure sport you hate, that'll look good on a college application process rather than playing the one you love. We need you to focus on an extracurricular case that will impress a college admissions director. Don't take a chance on an essay. Don't think about mathematics in a different way, even though your brain is just dying to solve the problem in a different way. We're downgrading the importance of curiosity. We're almost giving kids the message that curiosity is a triviality. It's a goofy thing, rather than probably the most important thing you can do to be in your maturation process of becoming a fully functioning and capable human being who's capable of reinventing themselves and blooming multiple times throughout their life.
Well, you think about how we structure, postgraduate education. You don't take a year or two off. You go from college, and which law school are you going to? Which medical school are you going to? Or if it's business, which consulting firm or bank are you going to go work at? Yes, there's the occasional, Peace Corps opportunity, but it seems to be the far exception, to the norm. We don't seem to encourage people sort of chasing that curiosity, the explorer that you realize that you were. And, when they do, we almost label them as apathetic, lazy, and suddenly they're way behind before they've barely, gotten out of the gates.
That's absolutely true. And there's a powerful case that more and more universities are coming to believe in of gap years. Mormons do this. So let's say you go to Brigham Young University between your sophomore and junior year, you'll take 2 years off to go on a mission. Almost no one really likes the mission. I mean, it's hard. If you're a young man, you wear those white shirts and the ties, and you ride a bicycle around on hot days, and you knock on people's doors who don't necessarily want to see you. It's not really what they're doing. It's the commitment to doing something that's hard and the natural maturation that takes place over those 2 years. So I would even call it an accelerated maturation, because your brain is naturally maturing and you're closer to prefrontal cortex maturity, but you're also doing something kind of hard. Mandatory military service, I know that thought scares a lot of people, but countries that have it, Israel, Singapore, Sweden, Switzerland, have better outcomes for their young adults than do similarly affluent countries that don't have it, like the UK, Germany, the United States. You could say, well, you're talking about smaller countries. The U.S. is a country of 330 million people, very, very multicultural. You can't scale from Israel and Singapore to the United States. Well, maybe you can't, but it's worth exploring. Everybody that I've talked to, our Forbes headquarters in Asia are based in Singapore. And I've talked a lot to my Singapore colleagues about the mandatory military service. And to a person, they say it was one of the most valuable parts of their lives. The educated ones are side by side with the less educated ones. The maturing takes place. Simply learning how to make your bed and being responsible for your own cleanliness and neatness and appearance and all of those things. These gap years they should be a little tough, which is about the only way you can blow a gap year is to have your parents underwrite a 2-year vacation.
It's interesting. A lot of people may not realize Israel is one of the high-tech meccas of the world. And there's a book, one of my favorite books, called Startup Nation, which attributes a lot of the success to the fact that they do have, mandatory service, and that people coming out of the military, just what they are given, the authority, the discipline, the structure at such a young age completely changes their mentality going into the workforce. I see it for sure.
Oh, yeah. Israel leads the world in certain kinds of communication technology and cyber defense technology. Palo Alto Networks, which is booming here in Silicon Valley, started out in Israel. I mean, it's an amazing wonder of the world. And you will hear the same thing about this accelerated maturation. I think is really important. No more important than it is for kids who don't have the good fortune of being raised by highly educated, motivated parents in a town like Palo Alto or Bellevue, Washington. I mean, the poorer kids with maybe not great parental role models need it even more. This is a part of society that's really suffering right now.
So, back to the argument of the value of late bloomers and people that take their time figuring out where they want to go in life. You mentioned some of the notable strengths of late bloomers, and the attributes you mentioned include curiosity, which we've touched upon here, compassion, resilience, insight, and calmness. The one that caught my eye, and they're all important, but resilience. Tell me about that and why you feel that's so unique with those a little bit further along in life.
Resilience isn't just the ability to be tough. Resilience is also the ability to have enough built-in flexibility so that an unexpected failure or an unfortunate blow in your life doesn't shatter you. A tough person isn't necessarily a resilient person if that first blow comes along and they shatter into pieces. And that's what we're seeing with these rising rates of anxiety and depression and et cetera, is that toughness and resilience aren't necessarily the same. Resilience is toughness plus that ability to absorb a blow learn from the blow, and get up. The late bloomers who suffered humiliation because they're comparing themselves to their peers on social media, or is plucking away at something and not getting credit for the progress they're making, even though they're making progress unnoticed by the outside world, or the person who's simply miscast. Their talents are over here and their sense of purpose is over here, but they're in a position way far away from that, and therefore they're unable to put their all into it. They're learning resilience. If they're surviving at all, they're learning resilience. The problem with late bloomers, the number one problem that can cause a late bloomer to get into a trap where they never do bloom is confusing their self-worth with where they are now. You know, where you are now has nothing to do with your self-worth. If you can get to the point where you truly believe you have inherent self-worth and that the blooming you simply hasn't had a chance to blossom, it hasn't been discovered, you're not in the right place, it's simply going to take you more time than it's going to take somebody else.
I want to talk about maybe a cousin of resilience, which is tenacity. I was fascinated in the book. You take this perhaps contrarian viewpoint to the popular self-help genre influenced notion that, you know, success is all to do with willpower and tenacity. And you actually suggest that there are times when the best answer is to quit as opposed to gutting it out. And you talk about how there is research out there that shows that we've got a finite amount of tenacity in us and it can be depleted. So we need to focus that muscle on goals that are truly most important to us. Otherwise, we'll just continually be exhausted. So when is quitting strategic?
Well, that's an important question. I wanted to say something positive about quitting because many of the insights that I've drawn throughout my career is the act of training for a long distance race. I mean, our lives are kind of a long distance race. There are certain punctuated parts of it where we're running faster. Imagine two people training for a marathon. They both have targeted the Boston Marathon and they both want to run 3 hours. So they're fit runners. They're not, you know, competitive runners, but they're fit runners where 3 hours is a realistic possibility. And one runner thrives running 70 miles a week. The other runner tries 70-mile weeks and breaks down every time that runner goes over 50 miles a week. It doesn't matter whether it's high-intensity running or high-volume, low-intensity running. They get injured or they get sick, and it undoes all the progress they've made in their training. Is the answer for the runner who's breaking down to gut it out, to just, it's all mental, to apply more tenacity and willpower? That's just stupid. That's something a Bush League coach, you know, with no creativity at all, you know, might try to browbeat into a high school kid who didn't know any better. No, the answer would be 50 miles a week is all you can do. If you need more training, we're going to have to figure out alternative ways of giving you a cardiovascular load through swimming or bicycling or something like that to bring you up to the equivalent of 70 miles a week. So when I look at, you know, all the challenges in life, for sure, developing a first response to stress by quitting. You know, every time I see a challenge that looks a little bigger than I am, I'm going to quit, or self-sabotage, is one of the worst things anybody could do. It's one of the worst habits that anybody could learn in their life. And the longer you do it, the harder it is to unlearn it. But the opposite of trying to bully your way through every challenge through grit and tenacity is just stupid. Using both the running analogy that I use, it's also stupid economically because it means you're valuing your sunk costs more than you are your future opportunities. You know, because I put all this time and effort into something, I simply have to keep butting my head against the wall to see it through. Well, you're overvaluing all that butting in the head that you've done because maybe your opportunity is 20 degrees to the left or 20 degrees to the right. There's always an optimal use in any given point, whether you're talking about sports or your career. At any given point, there's an optimal use of your time and your talent and your effort. If you're misaligned with your time and your talent and your effort, if you're misapplying it, then all the grit in the world is not going to get you where you want to go.
So, Rich, I'm sort of curious why you chose to write this book. I mean, I get that you're clearly the classic late bloomer archetype, but why was it important to share this message to the world?
I always wondered if my own story of late blooming might be useful to people. The fact that I was a security guard at age 25, despite having a Stanford degree, my slow, immature, ragingly immature start, if it might buck up someone who needed a little bit of bucking up. So that thought had been going through my mind for decades, not just years, but decades. It was reading about, first in the local press here in Palo Alto, and then a cover story in Atlantic Monthly called The Silicon Valley Suicides, about the suicides at 3 Palo Alto high schools. There were 6 of them. And the writer Hannah Rosen spent a lot of time doing the research and discovered that that was the tip of the iceberg. In March, there were more than 40 hospitalizations and treatments for what is called suicide ideation. And I thought, what is going on here? And that's when I knew that I had to write the book. If something positive could be said, then reveal it in a way that was academically defensible about our ability to bloom multiple times throughout our lives. And who exactly are we as human beings, and what are our capabilities as we move from our teens, young adults, mid-years, late middle age, and older age? You know, do our capabilities change? Do our passions change? Yes, they do. All of those things change. We're like the pitcher who throws a 100-mile-an-hour fastball when they're coming up into the major leagues, and then in their late 20s discovers that they will either blow their arms out if they continue to throw that hard, or they're going to have to develop a repertoire of pitches so they can fool the batters more. And the pitchers that generally have the long careers are the ones that have developed repertoires and aren't burning out their arms. You can only do Tommy John surgery so many times. And so that's kind of the arc of the human existence. And then when I got into that, I really wanted to at least toss the idea out there that maybe this up and out professional career track should look more like an arc. You know, there comes a time in our 40s and 50s generally when we reach the peak of our abilities to manage the most people and still work really hard and be responsible for numbers and all of those kind of things. It's the peak age for upper managers inside of organizations. And then the track in all too many organizations is that once a person is past peak, in one way or another, they're encouraged to leave because they cost too much. You know, we've got to make room for the up-and-coming people behind them, and we can't continue to pay you what we're paying. And think about the loss of all that coaching and wisdom that happens when those people go. And I'd really like HR and corporate legal to think about ways that you could design more career arcs for people, where in their 60s and even 70s, they could stick around and draw a paycheck, a considerably smaller paycheck, with a smaller title, but in a way that allowed them to make contributions to the company and that also was rewarding for them. That's kind of where I am at Forbes. You know, now in my 60s, I like to say that I'm in the emeritus part of my career at Forbes. I don't have the paycheck that I had at my peak. I don't have people reporting to me that I had at my peak. I work fewer hours. I work on projects where I can really make a difference. But my time is also free to write books and give speeches and do some consulting as I do for a Silicon Valley unicorn.
And podcast interviews.
And podcast interviews with the great Glenn Zweig and people of that caliber.
I always like to wrap up with this. You know, the name of the podcast is The Art of Excellence. I intentionally don't define it because I like my guests to define it. So when you think of the word, what comes to mind?
Going back to something I said earlier, that I'm not a naturally competitive person. I'm always tempted to think, when asked to think about excellence, to put up a metric. Well, In finance, you're excellent if you're a billionaire. In tech, you're excellent if you've started a company from scratch and take it public and it becomes a legitimate company, even if you aren't the CEO that's leading it 20 years later. You're excellent if you're Satya Nadella and you can turn around a company like Microsoft. And I don't mean to suggest all forms of excellence are at that Olympic level, but that there's a metric. There's something that you can actually put an accomplishment on paper, a number, whatever that is. But I also wanted to define it in a way that you truly, and this I think applies more to late bloomers and applies more to myself, that you found that intersection where exist your perfect native gifts and your sense of purpose that is so deep that you're willing to sacrifice for it.
I like it. The book, again, is called Late Bloomers, The Power of Patience in a World Obsessed with Early Achievement. I enjoyed it. I really did. I'm a late bloomer. I'm still blooming. One day, maybe I'll fully get there, maybe not. But it was a very well-written book and gave me a lot to think about. I highly recommend it. And you've been a great guest and really enjoyed this, Rich. Thank you.
Thank you for those very kind words, Glenn. It was an honor to be on your show.
Hey, thanks for listening. Okay, don't go yet, please. 2 favors. I ask simply 2 favors. One, if you could please download the iTunes app. You could do it on your phone. You could do it on the computer. Take 60 seconds and leave a review. It means a lot. 2, you can find my episodes on several social media sites, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. Find the one that you like the most. Find the one where you tend to have a lot of friends and followers. And if you could please either share it in the case of Facebook and LinkedIn or retweet it on Twitter, that would mean the world to me. So those are the 2 asks I have. I love putting together this podcast. I hope you enjoy listening to it. Thank you so much, and I will see you again next time. Bye-bye.